So this is the book that this is my most autobiographical book, although it is a novel, you know. So if of course that urge for people to sort of say, well, was it cathartic, or something. And of course, at some level it was cathartic, but if it was only about catharsis, it would have remained in my drawer. I just wanted to get all my feelings out about my mother. I think that is, for my journal and for my therapist, that's not for the novel. And that's not what this is. However, it is true that, it's born of very personal experiences. I had a terrible relationship with my mother. I don't think that if had I not written this book and really sat down just to think about my mother so much, I don't know I would have gotten to the point that I finally did of really being able to see her as a human being and to see her with a lot of compassion. And I just don't, you know what I mean? In other words, I think I would have been stuck in kind of a child position. And the same way, I guess you could sort of see when we're talking about gratitude, I'm kind of moving into an adult position where I can see things from the parent's point of view, not just the kid's point of view. I think that this is kind of an extension of that, where, I remember vividly being a child, at my mother's mercy, but I am not that child anymore. And also, my agenda is not it's just the same way we were talking about typical American, and I'm after Americanness, and I'm after constructions of ethnicity in Mona. I'm after something bigger, right? It's not just about me and my mother. That said, I did start with me and my mother. And my mother, I, she gets a lot of pages and she deserves them. She was a complicated person. I'm very proud, just really to even to see a Chinese American woman take up that many pages, because Chinese American women don't get that many pages, not of our generations. You know what I mean? They don't get that much attention. What is true is that my mother was born in 1925 in China, and she was born to a very wealthy Shanghai banking family. She was, she was the oldest of, the second half of the family. Is my grandfather had two wives. His first wife died. So I think the older two, the father wasn't that rich yet, so it was really this younger family where they grew up very wealthy, very privileged. That said, with that privilege comes or came some very, very, very old-fashioned ideas about gender roles, very old-fashioned. And there was my mother. My mother was smart as a whip, and she came afoul of those things. I mean, it's partly the times too, because Shanghai was modernizing. And her father, my grandfather, was actually, before he was a banker, he was an educator. So he had kind of progressive ideas. And so my mother was sent to this international school that had just opened. The international school was run by a radical group of nuns with very progressive ideas that did not comport at all well with, the dominant mores of Shanghai society. So my mother, was kind of caught between these two systems. And it's clear to me, although we don't, I can't know. I mean, we don't know what happened. I don't know what happened, and nobody knows what happened. It's clear to me that her mother was not with the program, you know, that her father was on one program and her mother was not. And her mother could have been quite right that when she kept on saying, no one's going to ever marry you, that could have been right. I mean, we don't know that she was wrong, but we do know that that she came down on my mother pretty hard for all that stuff. And that my mother eventually was so fed up that she basically left for America with no intention of ever coming back. That's a pretty extreme thing to do for a 22-year-old young Chinese woman. She came to America, and where things were really pretty difficult for her, I mean, and among them, it appears, and this again, it appears to be right. I can't, I will never know what really happened, but it appears that my grandmother cut her off financially. And it appears that my mother certainly had that impression. And anyway, and she had no money. So, okay, so you have this very rich girl. You can only imagine you send your daughter off for a year in France and you completely cut her off. I mean, kind of, and there's a revolution going on. So, my mother does not have any idea really how to support herself. And and things go on from there. And I, and as it very much affects our relationship. Now I've talked about all the, that's all the autobiographical stuff, and that stuff is all true. When I talk about why this is a work of fiction, as you know, in the book, I describe how she goes to stay with a family in Chicago. That is true. My mother went to go stay with a family in Chicago. Um, we don't know anything about that family. I do know that there was some guy that my mother was in love with before my father, and that he was very interested in baseball. And that went on. My mother went on to be an incredible baseball fan, as is all my siblings. And I know that my father was always kind of against baseball. And it turned out when she was 92, she had these glasses, these decorative glasses that were all across her dining room break front, like front and center. And it came out when she was 92 that those were a gift from this first boyfriend. They're all sitting there lined up in the rug. So that's all we really know about the first boyfriend. But and that becomes this character in my book, but that's all made up. In other words, and I actually think that they met in New York. I don't think they met in Chicago. So we don't know that he was a Cubs fan. We don't know, blah, 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 blah. So that's all made up. But you can kind of see it's like basically there are germs of truth, and some things are true, and emotionally, it's definitely true. But I actually don't know the facts. Do you know what I mean? And it's all made up. Just like Marty Mulligan, who was this friend. I did have a godmother who wrote to me every year without fail, and all my first books came from her. And I actually wanted to use her name in this book as a tribute to her, but Knopf was worried about my being sued, so he couldn't use her name. So she became Marty Mulligan. I always say the daughter is pretty close. I mean, obviously a lot of things are also, it's a novel. The same way I sort of say I compress things, the tour in and that first story about visiting China and thank you, Mr. Nixon, the tour is greatly compressed. So a lot of those scenes are from my life, but it's greatly compressed. Like, for instance, as is well known, I have made many, many trips to China. There are no trips to China in this book, right? So, I have definitely left some big things out, right? I'm
So
sure
what?
my high school boyfriend will be saying like, well, wait, she had a boyfriend. Why am I not in this book? On the other hand, other people are in the book and they are from life. Allison Mankin, who taught me to protest. I actually just saw her, about a month ago for my 70th birthday. And Allison, I actually ran that section by her to make sure it was okay. And she said it was fine. And then she said, but and she remembered the protest. We were protesting the fact that girls were not allowed to take shop. And she remembers the protest, but she said, I don't remember the shop teacher being so great. And I said, Allison, I made that up. No, he never just said he was nowhere near that witty. But just like Marnie Mulligan, what I do remember, great guy, supported us. I'm happy to give him a great scene in my book. It was my thank you to that shop teacher. Just like Marnie Mulligan, like, it was actually Judy McClernand. She didn't do any of those things. She never said any of those things. She certainly didn't write that email at the end of my book. I gave them to her. The feeling and the truth is there. The truth is she was a wonderful woman. And I'm happy to write her into this wonderful character. But Mrs. Cunningham too, again, there's a germ of truth. And there was a woman in the dead end where I lived, and she did teach me to crochet. And I was so grateful to her. And I loved to knit and crochet, and I crocheted and knit for many, many years.